Well, want to welcome everybody tonight. This, is the spring lecture series with the Greystone Society, and just want to thank our sponsors, the Huston Foundation and the Coatesville Savings Bank and Rayner and Company, but really our members and the people who subscribe to our programs that make our events the most exciting part. It's really nice to see everybody here tonight. It's a beautiful night, and it should be a really interesting subject. Susannah Brody is a author and storyteller. And portrays women in history. She has a Master of Arts in Oral Traditions at the Graduate Institute in Connecticut. I believe I got that right. And as well as is associated with women's history performers in the National Women's History Project. So, I think just listening to the story, just think about the amount of research that Susannah's done over the years on Rebecca and portrays her very well. She's written 3 books on Chester County, or 3-volume series on Chester County for about individuals of prominence, and Rebecca's covered in one of them. So we're very excited tonight to have Susannah here, so please welcome her as she portrays Rebecca Lukens. Thank you.
I love this room. It has held husband and children, and once rang with the glad and merry laugh of happy childhood. The grave has claimed them now in their young beauty, all but my 2 dear daughters. I live in a world of my own, and though tears will flow at the memories my fancy presents, still I love to linger, even amid the wreck of my buried joys, and remember times long gone. My earliest memories of childhood abound with examples of my father's indulgence. My father, Isaac Pennock, was a kind and generous man. His affection was fondly lavished on me. Every innocent amusement was allowed me. With my young friends, I bounded over hill and dell throughout Chester County. It was a time when I neither knew nor feared misfortune. I was very young when I began to learn about iron, for my father allowed me to accompany him on business trips. It was an activity that caused my mother much distress. At the age of 12, I went away to boarding school. Here, life opened a whole new world of charms for me. I was rapidly improving in my studies, a favorite of my teachers, and at the head of my class. For 6 years, the educational world was explored with enthusiasm. I was young, ardent, and happy. Books I read, or rather, eagerly devoured their contents. Stories of Huston and Lewis were of great interest. Shakespeare awoke the noblest feelings in my heart. I believe, had I been more select in my reading, it might have been of incalculable advantage to me. But no one directed or guided my choices. And so I have devoted my lifetime to reading everything that came in my path. I was 18 years old when I returned home after my final school term. As the eldest in a family that now included 4 sisters and 2 brothers, my mother was most anxious that I assist her and learn the duties of family. little brother George was often put in my care. But that spring, after a few weeks at home, I prepared to attend my father on a business trip to Philadelphia. The visit was a delightful one. During my stay, a friend of my mother's, Mrs. W., paid a call and introduced me to her companion, a physician named Charles Lukens. Dr. Lukens was above the common height. An air of grace and dignity were blended into his form. His hair was the deepest shade of black, his eyes hazel, his other features manly and markedly handsome. After they departed, my thoughts involuntarily returned to my conversation with the doctor, with an interest that I could not at that time define. That spring gave way to early summer, and nature wore her gayest garb. I recall it was a beautiful sunny day. I was sitting by the window. I had just put down Scott's fascinating Lady of the Lake, which had claimed my attention for some time, enjoying a beautiful sunset. I was so lost in my own reverie, I didn't hear approaching footsteps until Mrs. W. startled me with her greeting. Her husband and Dr. Lukens were with her. The next few days were given to the duties of hospitality. In the evenings, we often walked along the stream that crossed our property, and I ever found Dr. Lukens by my side. At length, he spoke to me, expressing how happy he'd been since we met. "My dear Rebecca," said he, "I must leave in the morning and return to the city. My medical practice needs attention. But will I be remembered in thy thoughts? Say then, dear Rebecca, might I hope to win thy love?" Surprise and diffidence at first kept me silent, but then a lengthy conversation followed. And when all was discussed, all resolved, our plighted faith freely exchanged. My heart beat with a painful quickness, for I was happy. I, the happiest of happy. Dr. Lukens and I were wed at Fallowfield Meeting on March 25th, 1813. My father persuaded my new husband to go into partnership with him at the Federal Slitting Mill. Dr. Lukens had some concerns about leaving his medical practice, but truly, he had fallen in love with rural Chester County. And he was reluctant, I think, to take his young bride too far from her home. A great joy came to us in August 1814 with the birth of our first child, Martha. Not long after that, 1815, I believe, my father began to urge us to come here to Brandywine, stating that we could pay a small rent and run the ironworks ourselves, with the understanding that when my father died, the Brandywine Ironworks would be left to me. We concluded to come that following year, about the time our daughter Elizabeth was born. Everything was in deplorable condition about the house, mill, and farm. Repairs were needed, and we bore the whole expense. Dr. Lukens was quite discouraged. I told my father I thought it scarce right that we should have so much to do, that the ironworks should have been put in good working order before we came. Invariably, his reply was, "What you're doing now will benefit you in the future. For when I am gone, this ironworks will be yours." The following year, about the time our son Charles was born, Dr. Lukens commenced rolling boilerplate. Now, this was quite risky, for it was a whole new branch of the iron industry, but he had high hopes for its success. Does thee know that my husband, Dr. Charles Lukens, was the first American ironmaster to successfully roll boilerplate? But those were very, very difficult years. The high costs of repairs, the complexity in refitting the mill to roll plate, but most of all, those were years of terrible personal losses. Our son Isaac was born in 1821, but died while still a babe. Isabella was born not long after his death. It was about that time that the dam that powered the entire ironworks was destroyed in a freshet. We had to rebuild the dam. We put in new water wheels, new pinion housings, new casings. It seems we were barely on our road to recovery when in 1824, my father, Isaac Pennock, died. His will did not clearly state that the ironworks would be mine. He left farms to my two brothers, but all the rest was put in the care of our mother, with a codicil added to his will that when my sister Mary Ann came of age, the rest of the real estate could be divided among the four daughters. As the eldest, I would have first choice, and I could choose the ironworks. In 1825, we lost our beloved son, Charles, at the age of 7. His death had a devastating effect on my health, and I soon learned I was expecting another child. Then in the summer of that year, 1825, I lost my dear and excellent husband and commenced my long, bitter, lonely struggle with life. This parting by death is a sorrowful thing for those that are left behind to mourn the loss of what alone gave them pleasure in life. I will not dwell on my feelings back then. When I looked around me, there was difficulty and danger on every side. An examination showed the books of the ironworks had a serious deficiency. I was left with 3 daughters and another one on the way. That year came to a kinder close with the birth of my dear Charles Anna, my 6th and last child. I had 4 daughters, and a promise I made to my dying husband. Charles asked me to continue with the ironworks, and I promised to try. I think I must have possessed some energy of character, for I look back on it now and wonder at my daring. My mother, although she offered no assistance to me, thought as a female I was unfit to carry on such a concern. She urged me to leave Brandywine. She said it would be a folly for me to remain. I respectfully but firmly replied to her that I must make the attempt. I urged the duty to my daughters, the promise I made to my dying husband, and that in a short while, the ironworks would belong to me, according to Father's will. My mother then startled me by replying, as she understood the will, it was up to her to decide when the properties might be divided. She then urged me to promptly repay the claim that was held by my father's estate against my husband's work at the ironworks. I told her it would be done as soon as practical, along with all the other debts I had found. Between my mother and me, there had never been that endearing familiarity which ought to exist between parent and child. I can well imagine in her youth she must have possessed many fine attractions. Her intelligence was superior, though her education had been sadly neglected. My mother possessed a vigorous and powerful mind. She thought I should leave Brandywine, that it would be folly for me to remain. But necessity is a stern taskmistress, and my every want gave me courage. Besides, I had made a promise to my dying husband. And where else were we to go? Pennock relatives were reluctant to assist me in this folly. But my husband's brother Solomon came to my rescue. Dear Solomon, he managed the ironworks, supervised the workers, and persuaded them to stay. He assisted me in dealing with the finances and with my Pennock relatives. He served as a father to my 4 daughters. Dear Solomon came to help out in an emergency and stayed for 15 years. He was there to help build the new mill and to offer comfort and support when my daughter Elizabeth died of scarlet fever at the age of 15. About a year after my sister Mary Ann came of age, my mother decided that it was time to divide the property. The Brandywine Ironworks was then appraised at its current value, and I became the proprietor. Now, I had already by that time addressed challenges from my Pennock relatives as to who should own the mill. I had paid my mother more than $4,000, but the ironworks was mine, as long as I paid my sisters, Sarah Pennock and Martha Coates, some $5,000, being the amount needed to equalize their share of the real estate with the most recent appraisal of the ironworks. But by the 1830s, the old mill had just about fallen down. Repairs were continuously necessary and ruinously expensive. Solomon and I decided that there was nothing to do but build a new mill. With Solomon's help, I have built a superior mill, though a plain one. And our character for rolling boilerplates stood first in the American market. But later in the 1830s, 1837 was a terrible year. We ran into some economic difficulties along with the rest of the country. Cheap, poor quality iron was being imported, leaving home businesses like Brandywine without protective tariffs. We decided to stop manufacturing plate for a while. Having amassed a considerable stock, we were reluctant to make more until the economy came back to normal. It was about that same time that my neighbors to the north challenged my rights to the dam that held the water that powered the mill and had for more than 25 years. As the economy recovered and we got back into active business, I looked forward to getting along with family and neighbors. Solomon decided that it was time to move on after assisting me for 15 years. The books were at that time in the capable hands of my daughter Martha, who joined the firm immediately upon finishing her schooling. But once the economy recovered, our business was growing at such an alarming rate that Martha felt that was too big a responsibility for her. So for a short time, she chose instead to run my household for me. What a joy Martha has been to her mother. But it wasn't long after that when Martha fell in love. I was so happy for her when she gave her affections to Abraham Gibbons, a young man of sterling character. They were also wed at Fallowfield Meeting in 1841. In 1844, my mother, Martha Pennock, died. Was I shocked when I learned that the primary beneficiary of my mother's estate was my brother George. The rest of us were virtually ignored. George, who has squandered his own assets and come to Mother time and again for assistance. Now, George is claiming that I received advancements from my father's estate, left for the benefit of all the children. He's supported in this by our sister Sarah. How many times must I pay for a property whose value was limited when my husband and I first came here? My mother spent more time in her widowhood with me than any of her other children. And I always treated her with kindness and respect. While others came to her for help, I paid her repeatedly for what father had promised to leave me. But I have learned of late that there was a dark, a malign influence exerted against me by those around her. And my being prosperous as the mistress of Brandywine is the cause. I weary of this constant struggle, dealing with house, farm, and mill. I worry, have I been given enough as a mother to my daughters? They seem content. I must smile when I see how happy Martha is with her Abraham. I made him a partner in the mill. He has helped me enormously. In 1848, Isabella married Dr. Charles Huston, and Charles Anna married Dr. William Tingley. Interesting, is it not? That two of my daughters followed my pattern and married Philadelphia physicians. Charles Anna was determined to marry her young man despite my reservations. Dr. Tingley is not as well grounded as my other sons-in-law. Indeed, he seems to live for the day. Dr. Huston is a fine young man. I made him a partner in the firm. That has worked out very well, allowing me to finally retire and get some much-needed rest. But I feel that having spent all those years in a state of constant excitement has had a detrimental effect on me. For now that I am home, my days all pass in a dreary and monotonous manner. I must find something to pull myself out of this lethargy. I realize my sadness shows. I try not to bring these thoughts forward, but they come unbidden to me. Several months have passed since I lost my dear Charles Anna. And in that time, what sorrow have we seen? She left in my care the darling babe, Annie, whose life was purchased with her own. And dearly do I love my little treasure. Dr. Tingley agreed that Charles Anna ask me to care for the baby. But I worried that he would try to interfere. And my concerns were well-founded. A friend of mine learned by chance that Dr. Tingley had petitioned the Orphans' Court in Philadelphia, seeking guardianship of his daughter and her estate. I was uncertain what to do. But my brother-in-law, James Penrose, that's Mary Ann's husband, came to my rescue. "I can tell thee what to do, Rebecca," said he. "Offer Bill Tingley a lump sum of money to renounce all claims to his daughter, and he will likely take it. It need not be a large sum either, for he is always out of pocket." And so it was done. I offered Dr. Tingley $500 cash. and he accepted. How could a father do such a thing to his own child? Would they have done that? Would they? Still, I worry that he will try to interfere. We only see him rarely these days. We see more of his parents. Little Annie is visiting her paternal grandparents right now. What a beautiful child she is. Happy, lovely, affectionate, in good health. The dark, lustrous eyes of her mother beam at me from her pretty little face. Annie will be the one now to cheer me when I'm sad. But I do tire easily these days. I really do need to rest till Annie returns. I love this room. It has contained husband and children, and once rang with the glad and merry laugh of happy childhood. Perhaps it will again one day.
For you on behalf of the Greystone Society.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aren't they beautiful? Now I offer opportunity for questions and discussion. Thank you. I'm going to get out of character now for a bit. Thank you, dear. Comments? Questions? It's lovely to see all of you here on such a beautiful day. Yes. She died in 1854. She was just short of her 61st birthday. And the time I'm interpreting is generally around 1850, because her daughter married in 1848 and she died about a month after giving birth in 1849. So she lived a little longer. Unfortunately, Annie, little Charles Anna, died when she was about 12. But Rebecca experienced some difficulties where wills are concerned. Her husband died in his mid-30s without a will, which of course was a major problem. Her father's will, he did add a codicil, which I guess he figured was going to be worded so that Rebecca would get the ironworks, but he didn't want to offend anybody, particularly I imagine his wife. And so wills were a challenge for Rebecca, and her will is extraordinarily lengthy and detailed, as some of you from the Greystone Society have probably examined it. And the other thing that happened was that when her daughter died, now Rebecca was insistent that her children were never going to run into the difficulties that she had. And I know some accounts on Rebecca's thing was that she was 31 years old and pregnant and had no money. That precisely might be true, but she wasn't without wealth. She was never without anything. But they had invested heavily in this ironworks, in modernizing it and in building the business. So what she really had when her husband died without a will was a cash flow problem. that the Pennock relatives had no interest in helping her with. They really thought that, of course, she was a woman, so she couldn't run the mill, and they were only too glad to take over that responsibility for her. And then when her daughter, Charles-Anna, died, I mean, she married Dr. Tingley, but Rebecca made sure that her daughters were all independently wealthy. Her daughter died without an estate, so she died without a will. It was within a year of when Pennsylvania, for the first time, had passed legislation addressing inheritances where women were concerned. The Quakers in southeastern Pennsylvania were among the ones that did write into wills protecting the wives and children, but often that was not the case, and any male relative could challenge whatever estate the widows had. So they had passed a law that if someone died without a will, the estate would be divided equally between the surviving spouse and any children that there were. Now, this complicates our thoughts on Dr. Tingley a little bit, because when Charles-Anna died, her baby was still alive. So whatever wealth she had was split between Dr. Tingley, her husband, and her newborn baby. So Dr. Tingley knew exactly what he was doing when he went to court. And of course, he went to court in Philadelphia because that's where he lived, but he didn't want his mother-in-law to know what he was doing. So he petitioned the court in Philadelphia seeking guardianship, and it's carefully worded, of his daughter and her estate. That's what he was after. And so when Rebecca died, her will is very, very lengthy. Now, her two sons-in-laws, who were the partners in the ironworks, and she had great faith in them, they, along with James Penrose, her brother-in-law, were executors of her estate. But the way she left it, each one of her daughters was left independently funds from her mother that Rebecca's executors could not control. So she made, even though those sons-in-laws were wonderful and she had good faith in them, she made her will to the point that her daughters were going to inherit substantial funds, and their spouses had no control over it. Now, apparently, they didn't have a problem with it anyway, because they also were partners in the ironworks. When Rebecca died, she was apparently known to be the wealthiest woman in all of Chester County. And she is the one that is responsible for that. It was a time in the second quarter of the 19th century when the iron industry was undergoing enormous changes. And most of the old water-powered and charcoal-fueled ironworks that were plentiful in this part of Pennsylvania simply eventually went out of business. Where Rebecca, when she was managing the Brandywine Iron Works, she actually worked to continually update and keep up with the times, so that by the time she turned over the active management of the ironworks to her sons-in-law, they were able to eventually come out with what became known as Lukens steel. And they really did that because Rebecca is the one that kept updating and kept things up to date and modernized the mill as the iron industry was progressing into what became the steel companies. So I have no idea what that started with, but my goodness, I did go on a bit, didn't I? Ron, could you get me a glass of water, please?
One more question. How active was the steel mill during the Civil War? What were they supposed
That's actually a good question, and I must tell you that I am not an expert on that. My concentration involving Lukens is very much on Rebecca, and she died in 1854. Lukens did work with the steel mill. Now, I will tell you that earlier in the 1840s, when Rebecca was still involved, the Navy asked for a contract from them, and she turned them down because of her Quaker beliefs that she was not going to support the military.
have much activities during the Civil War? I have to look it up.
But yes, and actually Scott might be able to tell you a little more of that. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's a,
Repeat the question.
you,
It's a great question.
What was the activity of the mill during the Civil War?
Okay. Yeah, the activity of the mill during the Civil War. I believe that they doubled the size of the workforce. Rebecca had about 17 men working for her and Solomon in the mill at any given time. I believe that they doubled that during the course of the Civil War, so they were running the same mill with twice as much. I think she expanded. They had 2 furnaces running on one 22-inch mill, and then in 1853, I believe they added 2 more furnaces. But she doubled the size of the workforce during the Civil War. They made their references to gunboats about supplying armor and iron for gunboats, and that could be boilers and gun carriages. Whether or not any particular class or particular product, it's hard to identify.
I don't think we have any documentation on them doing things like the Monitor or the ironclad boats.
Yeah, no, it's
At all.
just that it's referenced to Jefferson Davis and the iron for the gunboats. Nothing on the Monitor class or the Monitor
Right.
or anything like that. We'd love to find something stamped on that.
Yeah. Well, earlier, when Dr. Lukens, and I think he probably took his considerable scientific education and put that to work when he came into the iron business, and he is the one that foresaw that boilers, steam engines, were going to be a big business. And was it Cordova is the boat that was first tested? Codorus. I knew Cordova didn't sound right, but I couldn't remember the name. One of the first steamships was powered with plate. And I actually, last month, had an interesting question from somebody after all of this. Does everybody know what we mean by boilerplate? All those steam engines were built by metal pieces riveted together, and they had to withstand the steam that was going to create the power to run things. So that was when steam engines were first discovered and being developed. They realized right away that they were going to have very high quality iron, and it was going to have to be rolled into the shapes that they wanted. So that's what boilerplate is. And the boiler plates were pieces that were riveted together to operate the steam engines. And it was a huge business in the 19th century, huge. And Rebecca's husband is the one that was smart enough to see that as a future that they could really, really be successful with. And she was smart enough to stay with it. So she did very well. But as you may have sensed, she had some difficulties in her life. So,
When her mother died, she had a problem with her brother. Was it a monetary cash settlement?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that Rebecca says is that she thinks it would have broken her mother's heart if she knew and believed the truth in her brother. He was the youngest, and he was a ne'er-do-well. He did not make success of just about anything he did, and his mother was constantly supporting him. I suspect that Martha Pennock had some sense of this, because although she left virtually everything left in her estate to George, she left it in trust for him. She had someone else managing the estate and all of whatever her holdings she had at the time, and gave him an annual income. So, as Rebecca says, her mother had a superior mind. I think she must have felt something. And apparently, the brother often lived with the mother, and so did the unmarried sister, Sarah. And they apparently, as Rebecca says, a dark, malign influence against her. They kept saying to the mother. Now, from my interpretation of Rebecca, I would say that Rebecca probably didn't care whether her mother left her anything. But her name is not even in the will. She's not even mentioned in her mother's will. And she was the one that, as she said, she saw more of her mother after her father died than anyone else. Now, they were never close, and I think part of that is that Rebecca was clearly her father's favorite. So, and Rebecca, her father let Rebecca do just about anything, and Rebecca was smart and educated and dearly loved her father, and just had success in many ways. And I think that it was never a close relationship with her mother.
Did his siblings have similar education as Rebecca?
As far as I know. Now, in the research, we lose track of the other brother, Isaac. I suspect that he died. I know that he lived long enough to get married, but he apparently passed away before the mother did. And her other sisters, Martha married, I want to say Moses Coates, but no, this is Rebecca's sister, not her daughter, married somebody Coates. So Martha Coates. Mary Ann married James Penrose. They were very, very prominent citizens in the area. So the sisters did well. And I would assume that they had the same educational opportunities that Rebecca had. Rebecca, when she was 12, went to the Westtown School for 1 year. And after that, she went to Wilmington Friends, or another Quaker boarding school in the Wilmington area. That's not clear, but she went to Quaker boarding school, and of course the Quakers believed in educating their women. She says something in her autobiographical notes that Westtown wasn't right for her. And I think part of it is that Rebecca, after the Quakers split into the Hicksite and Orthodox, the Hicksite were the progressives. The Hicksites are the ones that actively and vocally opposed slavery. The Hicksites are the ones that participated in the Underground Railroad. Now, the Orthodox were the ones that they felt that they were still following the original Quaker beliefs. And Rebecca was Orthodox. So her husband and her younger children that died early are all buried in Fallowfield Meeting in Erselton. Rebecca is buried, there is, as far as I know, it's still a little church, but there's a little church. If you go on 82 into Erselton, just before the road makes the turn, and the Quaker meeting is off here, there's a little church and a little cemetery, And that was the Orthodox meeting when the Quakers split. Rebecca is the one that funded building that other little building. And that's where she's buried.
Is that south of here? Or
Yeah, 82 South. If you take 82 South and you follow it the way it does now, where you're going out Business Route 30 for a little bit and then turning it there, I mean, you can get to the same place by taking this road. But if you take 82 South, before this road comes into it, where you would have to turn left to stay on 82, and I mean, if you take this road, you come into that intersection, and right ahead of you is the Fallowfield meeting. It's still an active Quaker meeting. Well, if you take 82, 82 comes around like this. That little church building is right on this side before 82 makes that big left turn. And that's where she's buried. Because what happened is generally at that time when the Quakers split up, whatever was the majority of the group, Hicksite or Orthodox, they're the ones that kept the meeting. And the other ones left. Now, that didn't always happen. I lived in Euclid Township for more than 30 years, and the Euclid meeting, which is, by the way, often open for visiting, was interesting. Apparently, they were just about split, and what they did is they both met in their same meeting. They split the meeting house by putting wooden barriers right down the middle of it. And one met on one side and one met on the other. And then, of course, years later, when the Quakers, well after the Civil War, the Quakers resolved their differences and came back into one group, then, you know, in Euclid it was pretty easy. But, yeah, but it's an important thing as far as Rebecca is concerned, because Rebecca was Orthodox Quaker. Now, she was opposed to war, she was opposed to slavery, she was in favor of the abolition of slavery, but she was not a Quaker activist. She was busy running a business. So, now, I think that's probably long enough, although it is a lovely, lovely weather to be sitting out here on this beautiful porch. I'd be happy to talk individually to anyone.
Thank you.
Sue, was that a hand up? Okay. You can talk to me later about it if you want. That's actually a good question, and I don't know. But there might be some research on there. I don't know where. Oh, where'd you go? Sorry. Did you hear her question? No. Before the Civil War, do you know whether the ironworks employed any free slaves or free blacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't have real names on people. I just have the size of the workforce. Yeah. But that'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah.
It's not. It could be a possibility.
Well, I can answer not for the ironworks here, but where I used to live was the Marianne Forge, more commonly known as Dallin Forge, north of Downingtown, and that definitely did. They had a little free black community that, if any of you know Route 113, where the Woodmont North apartments and condos are, there was a little black community in there, and there still is a cemetery in that area. And we were able to specifically tie in names of people that are buried there with names of iron workers. And in the early years, around 1800 and before, they were, any that were mentioned were generally laborers. But by the 1820s and on, at that iron works, they had black iron workers, who, by the way, at least at Dallin Forge, were paid the same rate as the other men. So it certainly exists. And Rebecca Lukens, actually, starting with her father and then her husband and then Rebecca and then her sons-in-law, had at least 65-year working relationship with the Dowland Forge. They were the ones that did the primary refining of the pig iron into wrought iron so that it could be reworked at the rolling mill. And they had a huge, huge contract. That's actually where I first ran into Rebecca and found that it was very interesting. And when her husband first died, their books listed it as the estate of Charles Lukens. So I imagine they weren't too sure what was going to happen there. But it was within a year after he died that the books changed the name to R.W. Lukens, and that's Rebecca. That was probably more information than you needed. Deborah.
Dan, before we stop, will you just tell us how long your research lasted before you could actually do your first presentation? And also,
Oh, wow.
And also how much of, because I noticed the speech patterns and the words are so traditionally colloquial for that particular time period. How much of that did you pick up in your research, and how much did you have to do to gather that text, that language?
Okay. That's actually a very good question. And by the way, this is Deborah Pieri, who is a teacher at East Fallowfield School and a professional storyteller. And she's the one that got me into storytelling when we were both a lot younger. Right. Anyway, the research, well, I was researching the iron industry on this other project when I found Rebecca. And then I was doing a museum internship at the Historical Society at a time when the director there was looking for women for the exhibit. And so I decided to take that opportunity to develop, what we really did then was put together a resource book, just everything I could find about Rebecca and where it might be located and how to find that. And so that was in the early 90s. Now, after I stopped teaching and I was volunteering at the Historical Society, is when I actually got into developing it. And at that time, the director of public programs at the Historical Society was Bill Kashadis, who actually got his PhD developing living history portrayals. And he used to work at Independence Hall, and he did William Penn. He's got a great living character of William Penn. And he, of course, he couldn't do a woman. So he kind of encouraged me to do something to develop it, and he knew by then I was into storytelling. So what I did, the script that I originally developed, and I will tell you that it's never word for word exactly the same thing, because following the storytelling principle that Deborah taught me is don't memorize. Because if you memorize, you may be standing in front of an audience and forget the next word. And if it has to be that word, you're lost. So the idea is you're supposed to just absorb the story know well enough that you can express it. And with Rebecca, I was very fortunate because she wrote a couple of things that were extraordinarily detailed. And after her husband died, she started an autobiography. And the reason and she states very clearly that the reason that she wrote it was that they lost their father at such a young age. And she felt that it was a very emotional time for her, and she felt that she needed to write this down so that if anything happened to her, her children would have that story of her parents. Well, she wrote beautifully up until the time that her husband died. And then she got busy in the ironworks and she didn't write anything. And then, after her mother died and her brother decided to challenge her rights to the ironworks, that was when she actually did go to court. And her attorney asked her to write down her history of the Brandywine Iron Works as she understood it. Now, transcribed, we don't have the handwritten one like we do the autobiography, but transcribed, this is called the statement. It was done in 1850. Legal size paper, 6 pages, single space typing. And I think at that point, she had had enough. She had paid for this ironwork so many times. And basically what her way of resolving things was she didn't want to go to court, so generally she paid people off. So, an uncle or a cousin challenged her rights to the ironwork. She said, okay, what do you need? And she gave them the money. The neighbors to the north challenged the rights to the dam, because what was happening was during heavy rain things, the dam was filling up to the point that it was flooding their land. So they weren't happy with that. She paid them off. But when her brother challenged her rights to this, after all that they had gone through, and all the financial assistance he had gotten from her mother when she was still alive, I think she said enough is enough. So she wrote out a detailed history of the ironworks. Then the one other thing that she did was, after she retired from active management of the ironworks, she started to keep a diary. Now, how many of you have ever done a diary? Ever? How many of you do it faithfully day after day after day? How many of you kind of drop off and don't pick it up for 6 months? That's what Rebecca did. So the diary is much shorter. She started again writing it during a time of deep, deep emotional sorrow. It was after her daughter Charles Anna had died. So some of the things that she says come out of that. It's a very, very emotional time. And then she writes for a few days, and then she writes, and again in 3 months, and so it's very intermittent. And that actually has not, to my knowledge, I actually started on it, but I didn't finish, has not been transcribed so that it's available for easy reading. Her handwriting is this tiny. It's very, very difficult. But it gives, once again, another look into her life. And that's where I got most of the text. Now, some of the things came from letters and such. There's a lot, but mostly those 3 things: the autobiography, the statement, and the diary, offer a tremendous look into this woman and how she felt. Of course, most of the time that she was writing these things, she was emotionally upset. So she sits there and says, it's such a. My life is so dreary, oh, woe is me, and then I guess she gets busy with life, She built this house for her daughter Isabella, who married Charles Huston. Her daughter Martha, who married Abraham Gibbons, lived in the house that was where that beautiful lawn is there. Oh no, across the street. Who was in this one? One of the grandchildren?
The one son, Charles Huston.
Oh, their son, Charles, lived there. And the Association for the Blind or Deaf, the VFW is the Gibbons house. That house was also a grandchild of Rebecca's. Greystone was built by one of her grandsons if you've ever been there. Greystone? That was built for a new bride. Can you imagine being a young bride and moving into that mausoleum of a place? Excuse me. It was great when it was the city hall, you know, because that's what it looked like. The interior is absolutely beautiful. It's still gorgeous, but you know, that I just think and it was built by renowned Philadelphia architects who are better known for building college buildings. And that's what it looks like.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind. Is Rebecca, obviously, you know, from the Penix and the extensive Quaker network, she signed all of her documents RWL, Webb, which is her mother's maiden name.
Yes.
And just interesting that she didn't.
That was a Quaker tradition. You know, today we tend to do, like, my maiden name is Wilson, so if I'm using my entire name, I do Susannah Wilson Brody. I don't do Susannah Elizabeth Brody. But in the 19th century, the Quaker tradition was when they married, they dropped their maiden surname and they kept their first name and middle name if they had it. And Rebecca was Rebecca Webb Pennock. Her mother's maiden name was Webb. So once she married, she became Rebecca Webb Lukens, and she signed things or initialed things RWL. That's why the W. And it is for her mother's name. It was, the Webb's another prominent Quaker name. If you study the Quakers in southeastern Pennsylvania, a lot of these families have been around for more than 300 years, and they're all related to each other by now. But there's a lot of names that really stand out. The Pennocks were huge prominent family in the 18th century, and Primitive Hall is still open to the public. That's another one. That was Joseph Pennock, who was the first. Well, he wasn't really the first Pennock. His father was the first one that came over, but you know, he was the prominent one in Chester County anyway. So anyway, I'm happy to chat with people if you want to informally, but I'm going to turn off the microphones and.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to. There was one quick question, you know, about the houses. Was Rebecca's house the Stuart Huston Charitable Trust bought Rebecca's house from Middle Steel Company in 2006 and gave it to the Greystone Society, and we're writing grants right now for its restoration. We have a grant in front of the Getty Foundation for the Historic Structures Report, which is the first thing, and we want to commence that next year and really start to study her house and work on her house. Obviously, the 200th anniversary is in 2010, so hopefully we'll be underway by then, but it probably won't be restored. We also look to rebuild her mill, showing how, you know, the small size of the mill with 2 furnaces and what a 22-inch rolling mill looks like, and so we're working towards that. This house is Terracina, which Charles Huston came back from Europe and had been exposed to the European designs, but Rebecca financed the building of the house in 1849, I think, shortly after they were married. In 1848, I believe they were married, Isabella and Charles.
1848 is when they were married, and this house would have been started soon after that.
Soon after that. Yeah. So, yeah, enjoy this house.
Thank you for reminding me. Rebecca's house does still exist. It's down the road. It's what happened to Rebecca's house, and it is officially called Brandywine Mansion. But those of you that have been to Hibernia, now there's a mansion that was built by the ironmaster to show his success, and it was built for his family. Well, Rebecca and her husband lived in Brandywine Mansion. It's not a mansion, it's just a house. And once she had to take over the ironworks at the age of 31, she didn't have time to worry about the house. So, you know, those ironmaster houses were definitely a sign of prestige. You know, I'm building this great, wonderful place for my family, and everybody will see how successful I am. Well, this is my opinion. Rebecca didn't have time for that. So she stayed in her house, and she was quite content to be in her house. But the houses that she built for her daughters show the prestige. And Greystone Society has acquired this house. You can see it. You can actually see the shape of the house in it, even though the iron company years ago, built this huge thing onto the house. It was used as the company store for many, many years. So, you know, it eventually it will get incorporated into their museum plans, and I can't wait to go sit in Rebecca's house. I mean, when I start with "I love this room," that is directly from Rebecca's diary. She is sitting in her house, and she says, "I love this room. It contained husband and children," and you know, that is directly from her words. So.
You'll have to let us know when you do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming.